Hi everyone, this is Naomi Christensen. I will be presenting on our Week 2 summary. A major aspect of social psychology is the social self. This can include anything from self-esteem to self-presentation, or how one presents oneself to others around him or her. The textbook follows 3 important ABCs of the self, which include affect, behavior, and cognition. And once we have a better understanding of ourselves, we can better understand and perceive others. So the first chapter that we read in our textbook is all about the social self, which includes the main points that the authors wrote about, including self-concept, self-perception, motivation, self-esteem, and self-presentation. And the second chapter that we read focused more on perceiving other people. And this would include observation, attribution, integration, and the self-fulfilling prophecy. And the ones that I have starred on these slides are the ones that I will be focusing on more specifically later on. The first chapter that we had to read in our Theories in Social Psychology textbook was Attribution Theories, How People Make Sense of Behavior. This author focused on 3 different theorists, including Hyder, Jones and Davis, and Kelly, and their different contributions to the attribution theory in general. The last chapter we had to read for this week in our Theories in Social Psychology textbook was Social Comparisons, Motives, Standards, and Mechanisms. The authors of this article focused on the social comparison theory and focused more specifically on 3 different questions in this theory, including why, to whom, and how. And I will elaborate later on in this presentation on those 3 questions. The article Consumers' Responses to Negative Word-of-Mouth Communication, an Attribution Theory Perspective focused on the attribution theory, and the researchers wanted to see if there was any sort of effect on consumers based on word-of-mouth communication. And eventually they did find that there was a significant effect between negative word-of-mouth communication and consumers' responses, and they also focused on how the attribution theory was involved with this. The article on friend networking sites and the relationship to adolescents' well-being and social self-esteem focused on well-being, self-esteem, and feedback, which includes both positive and negative feedback. The goal of this study was to find if there was a relationship between social media sites and adolescents' self-esteem, and they did find that there was a significant relationship. For those adolescents who received positive feedback on their social media sites, their self-esteem improved, whereas the adolescents who received negative feedback had a lowered self-esteem. The 5 key terms that I will be focusing on in this presentation include self-esteem, attribution theory, social comparisons, motivation, and self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-esteem is essentially how one views oneself, including both positive and negative observations. And depending on these observations, one can either have a high or a low self-esteem, though this can fluctuate throughout one's life depending on life circumstances and experiences. High self-esteem is associated with being happy and successful, whereas individuals with low self-esteem are more associated with depression and failure. One component that can affect self-esteem is technology, as seen in the article by Vogenberg et al. And they explain that there is a significant impact of social media and networking sites on adolescents today, with 78% having a positive impact, which increases self-esteem, whereas the 7% who had a negative experience resulted in a lowering of self-esteem. And they explained that there are 3 different ideas behind how technology impacts social self-esteem, and that is the number of relationships, frequency of feedback, and the tone of feedback. And this feedback is from the friends on their social media. An attribution theory is how people explain behavior. There are 3 famous researchers credited for the attribution theory, which include Hyder, Jones and Davis, and Kelly. According to Malle, Hyder was the original researcher to develop this idea, with the theory further explaining the why questions of behavior. However, most explained throughout our textbooks is Kelly's involvement within the theory formation. He developed the covariation principle, which is defined as factors that causes behaviors that need to be present when it happens but absent when the behavior is. The article that we read on negative word-of-mouth communication focuses on the attribution theory and how word-of-mouth communication, specifically the negative aspects, can be explained through attributions. And they focused on the why question and why does a consumer negatively communicate about a brand. And there needs to be 3 components in order to understand how much of an impact word-of-mouth communication is having, which includes consensus, is how much do others agree, distinctiveness, associating information with one brand but not others, and consistency, how often negative experiences occur. Social comparison can be guided by 3 questions, which include why, to whom, and how. The first question asks, why do individuals compare? The answer to this is that they want to better know themselves, they want to have a more positive self-image by comparing below oneself, and they feel the need to self-improve by comparing above oneself. It's quoted in the textbook that it is to fulfill fundamental needs such as self-evaluation, self-enhancement, and self-improvement. The second question posed is to whom do they compare to? This can be answered one of 3 ways: to people similar to themselves for self-evaluation, to those inferior to oneself for self-enhancement, or to those superior to oneself for self-improvement purposes. The question how it influences oneself is answered through motivation. Depending on the way the individual compares to others will influence and motivate him or her, as previously discussed in the second question. The 4th key concept is motivation, and there are 2 different aspects within this, which include intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is to find interests within oneself, and this is for the sake of the person. And the second one is extrinsic, which is finding interests outside of oneself. So this is for more tangible reasons to do something. And linking this back to social comparison and the article that we read, depending on what motivates you, it can lead to your self-enhancement. So the last key concept I will be talking about today is the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the expectations one or others place on oneself that can lead to behavior that fulfills those expectations, whether that be good or bad. There's a 3-step process to this prophecy. It includes the individual forms thoughts and impressions of someone else. That individual acts on those impressions, and this other person picks up on those and may unknowingly adjust to behavior to those impressions. The first question I have for you guys today goes back to the first key concept, self-esteem. Where are we as Christians supposed to draw the line between self-esteem, both positive and negative, and pride? The second question I have reverts back to the self-fulfilling prophecy. Suppose you were the teacher in the example in the textbook about self-fulfilling prophecy. What could you do to minimize those biases of the students, and how vital do you think this situation is in everyday life? In conclusion, social psychology presents itself through not only social aspects, but also through the self. If one does not understand oneself, it would not be possible for one to understand others. An important aspect of the self is self-esteem, which every individual has varying degrees from high to low. Motivation is an important aspect of the self, and social comparisons can occur, which typically involve the lowering of the self-esteem. However, it can also raise it if comparing below oneself. Self-fulfilling prophecy can happen if you allow yourself to be influenced by others' thinking or even by your own. Attributions are made in order to explain how behavior happens, and this behavior can either be directed at self or at others. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a good semester.